So we're going to switch gears from clinical from my end, to talking about tissue engineering from a different perspective. And this is more of my hope especially for the future, the near future. And the reason is that I have watched, because I've been around a long time, some of the evolution of medical innovation. And it's an empirical science, and most of it has been guided by perception throughout our lives. What fortunately happened while I've been alive is that technology has extended our limited perception, because our perception actually is very limited if you talk about the world around us. For example, my dog can hear things long before I can hear. In addition, we have better discipline than in the past. We have statistics and scientific review. But the challenge remains that we're still having to do in vivo testing. And in vivo testing is what I'm trying to do with my work. And the costs are staggering. And for the cost, the return is statistical. It's not exactly a huge benefit, in my opinion, to go through all of that. We usually can find out safety and efficacy by prediction before we even start. So what do the physical sciences do, like physics or engineering? So what's typically done is the problem is defined, initial conditions are established, the physical constraints and limits are identified, the inputs and outputs of the system are identified. In our case, as humans, it's what's going through our nose and mouth and what's coming out of us. And that includes sweat glands and everything, hair growing on your head and whatever. And then there's a modeling of whatever process. So the one thing I do want to say, having grown up as an engineer, is that there isn't much difference between a factory and our liver. The only difference is instead of silicon, it's carbon. But for some reason, engineers are able to totally model and predict what a factory does in terms of input and output. But we can't really do that precisely enough to avoid having to do clinical trials when we're working with the liver. So after the process is modeled, most engineers make qualified assumptions to be able to then solve the problem. So quantitative sciences have it very easy. We have been stuck as medical scientists in an empirical rut because that's what we all inherited when we came into the fields from our predecessors. So one fact that is very evident is logical progression is inexorable. It will just move forward, period, with time, because we are wired to build on knowledge. And the big crime in society is when impediments come up to that progression. For example, there's only one Einstein in the 20th century, and he changed a lot. How rare is it to get an Einstein? And in a war, if you kill somebody, you not only kill that person, but all of his progeny forever. And you never know if that lineage would have had another Einstein. So it harms all of society, and it definitely harms the next generation. So physical scientists use logic and math to derive theories from the subatomic to the cosmological, despite limitations to their five senses. On the other hand, medicine's endpoint is good health. The starting point is a disease. Medicine knows how nature orchestrates good health and how disease manifests. Despite all the advances, the treatment path still requires in vivo trials. Merging physics and other hard sciences with biology is accelerating right now. For example, the research into consciousness and into learning is now a priority in the AI race, because AI is not AI yet. So medicine is entering the era when analytical modeling of health and disease, aided by fundamentals in physics, will yield superior solutions without the encumbrances of expensive and inefficient clinical trials. We just aren't there, but we will get there faster if we understand more than we do. And what I'm going to do today is show you things that you may have learned, you may not have learned, but maybe will give you some insight about how to look at disease and engineering differently. So I'm going to give you an example in medicine of medicine in transition. That's a protein there in the left lower quadrant. The 3D shape of a protein informs protein function. There are lots of proteins. Actually, 200 million proteins are known. Not exactly, but a lot. The problem is the way proteins can fold on each other is 10 to the 143rd power. That's a mathematical calculation. That's an impossible number to understand. So the variety of proteins, if we used pre-2020 technology, certainly not in our lifetime or many lifetimes will we be able to get a handle. So pre-2020, it took weeks to months to make a protein crystal for X-ray crystallography. And then it took hours to then yield the shape. Now, post-2020, and this resulted in a Nobel Prize, it takes seconds to minutes for AlphaFold AI to generate the shape from the amino acid sequence alone. So you just stand at a computer, turn on this program, type in the amino acid sequence, and you got the 3D shape. And don't forget that informs function, and that opens a whole world for quantitative prediction of outcomes. So that's just an example. So now I'm going to maybe teach you something that you don't know, or you may know it, but you forgot it. And so where is our mass? Most people, when I ask that question, they answer with tissues in the body. The most common answer is water, and true enough, it's 60% of our mass. They answer cells, and actually we are 43% human cells and 50% bacteria and fungi. They answer bone, fat, protein, fat. That number is for thin people. The other question I get, answer I get is it's in water. And actually that number in people varies. In babies, there's more percent water than in adults. And there's 80% of our brain is water. But the real answer is our mass is equal to the sum of the mass of all our molecules. And you're wondering, why the heck is he talking about that? So just be patient. If our mass is in our molecules, that means our mass is the sum of the masses of all our atoms. 96% of our atomic mass is from oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen. And oxygen is the most common, 65%. Now, if you look at that molecule, you'll see the blue dots. And if you remember anything from chemistry, the two in the middle, the blue dots, are the s orbital, and the valence electrons are in the outer orbital. There's 6 of those. But electrons have no mass. They're essentially a point in space. And they're really a cloud, but this is a picture that we learn, which is actually not accurate. An electron is an excitation of the electron field. So that doesn't have much mass. So in reality, our mass is equal to the sum of the mass of our nuclei. The electron's very little contribution. So our nucleus is made out of protons and neutrons. So our mass is equal to the sum of the mass of our protons and neutrons. Anybody disagree? Good, because it's a true statement. The problem comes when we get to this level. Each proton and neutron contains 3 quarks. That's a subatomic particle. Now, the problem is the mass of 3 quarks is less than 5% of the mass of a proton or a neutron. So what are those squiggly yellow lines? Those are gluons. That's the physics name for a particle that's another point particle like an electron. The only catch, well, first I'll say the mass of each quark is generated from the Higgs field, and Higgs is a Brit. He's still alive. It's a scalar energy field that permeates the whole universe. It's not a vector field, and it's never zero throughout the whole universe. But its contribution is it gives mass to quarks, electrons, neutrinos, and bosons, which we'll get into in a minute. But getting back to this, that's a gluon right there in pictorial format. And the problem about that gluon is it has no mass. No mass. Even though it's drawn as a circle there are 4 of them, and this is the inside of a proton because there's 2 up quarks and a down quark. They're massless. So they don't control. So the question really is, where is our mass? Now, gluons move at the speed of light between quarks, and they have momentum, inertia, and energy, but they have no mass. So where is the missing greater than 95% of our mass? We started off with the average height of a human, 1.7 meters, and we end up down at the quark, which is 10 to the minus 18 meters. And then we have the gluon up there, which is a point and has no dimension. So where is our mass? If you look at it in table format, protons and neutrons are called nucleons. The contribution to a nucleon mass from each quark is about 1%. But the answer to the question is, our mass is energy from the gluon field and from the kinetic energy of the quarks jumping back and forth between the energy of the gluons jumping in back and forth between the quarks. And that's defined by quantum chromodynamics. So actually, your mass is energy. Mass energy equivalence. Where did that come from? That's from special relativity. It created a space-time framework where mass and energy must be equivalent and convertible for the laws of physics to remain consistent for all observers. Now, if anybody doubts this being a fact, think of an atomic bomb. That's a split atom. It's a uranium atom, not a hydrogen atom, and think about the energy released. So this is one of the most profound and non-intuitive results in all of science, and it flows directly from the geometry of space-time. Now, how many people here in tissue engineering ever thought from that perspective that we are all energy and we should be thinking in the direction of energy upward toward life instead of just starting at the level of life? It makes a difference. So how do you calculate the mass energy equivalence? It's very simple. There are 2 forms of the same concept, and the formula is E equals mc squared. For any process within a closed system, the total mass energy before the process has to equal the total mass energy after it. So we're going to just mention, this is the gluon field energy that we're talking about right now. That's where that 95% of your mass comes from. And that is a proton with 3 quarks, 3 wavy lines that are the strong nuclear force that's holding those quarks together. And those blue lines outside of the proton are leakage of that energy outside And that proton, those blue lines outside are actually what are holding your protons together in the nucleus and your neutrons, because protons each have the same charge. Have you ever stopped to think, why is it the nucleus doesn't blow apart with all those positive charged protons in there and some neutrons? The answer is because of this field. So the part that's inside the proton, that's a strong nuclear force at maximal power. It confines quarks within the proton or neutron, and it's responsible for more than 99% of our mass. The nuclear binding force is a residual effect of the gluon field injury. That's those blue lines outside of the proton, and that's what keeps protons together, socially happy in the atom. And that's what's responsible, by the way, even though it contributes very little to our mass, that's responsible for the nuclear explosion when you get an atomic bomb go off. It's that second part, the nuclear binding force. It's not the first part, which is far bigger, but that doesn't get involved in nuclear explosion. So where is our mass? Less than 5% is your quark mass, which is from the Higgs mechanism. Greater than 95% is the mass of the gluon energy generated by the strong nuclear force holding our nuclei together, and you can calculate it. And this is one of the best examples of how predictive equations led to an answer that was proven correct to like 6 significant figures. It was considered a major reinforcement for the things I'm going to show you next. So quantum chromodynamics, I'm not going to go through this in detail except to say that it is a mathematical model. It defines how quarks interact via the exchange of gluons. It defines the confinement of quarks and protons and neutrons. It defines the glue that holds atomic nuclei together and explains mass and the existence of protons and neutrons. Now, the part in gold is really the key statement. Since protons and neutrons from the atomic nuclei of all matter, they form all matter all over the universe. Quantum chromodynamics explains the existence of all matter in the visible universe. That sounds like a lot. The only problem is the visible universe, like this table or the sun or a planet or a meteor, that's only 5% of the universe if you add it all together. The rest of it, physicists can't see, and you've heard about it. It's called dark energy and dark matter. So the bottom line, we are energy. So if we're going to start modeling ourselves, we have to start thinking along this line. And the way to prove it to you is if I turn off the lights right now, you wouldn't see each other, because as a body, you don't radiate in the visible wavelength. But if I gave you an infrared detector to wear, that's what you would see. You are radiating very well. You just don't have the eyes to see it. So evolution of life from energy starts with the Big Bang. The Big Bang is a concentration of what's called almost infinite energy. That explosion occurred, and soon after that explosion, you got the fundamental forces that arise, and I'm going to show you that in a second. Then you have quarks, protons, and so on and so forth. Eventually, you get to an atomic nucleus, neutral atoms, molecules, stars, planets, RNA, DNA, marine life, and land life. So we're going to touch on all that very quickly. So first thing is the fundamental forces. They all developed really quickly. In fact, if you look at the time at the bottom, that's 10 to the minus 12 seconds after the Big Bang. All the forces of the 4 fundamental forces of the universe were present before 1 second. So if you want to say God woke up and said, boom, that's a good example of boom, got all the forces. So the strong nuclear force is the strongest, and I'm going to rate it as 1 for magnitude. Its range is very short, 10 to the minus 15 meters. Its action is on the gluon, and we already talked about it. The electromagnetic force, which by the way is what prevents my hand from going through the table, Those are the covalent bonds and all the other bonds that exist. The strength of it is 137 less than the strong nuclear force. The electromagnetic field extends for infinity, and its particle effector is the photon. The weak nuclear force is very important. It's 1,000,000 times less powerful than the strong nuclear force. We're going to show you that in a minute. It acts through the bosons, which I know is a weird name, but the bosons get their mass from a Higgs field, whereas the gluon is massless and photon is massless. The action of the weak nuclear force is over very short distances. And then gravity. Look how strong gravity is in relation to the nuclear force, the strong nuclear force. It's 10 to the minus 39 as strong. That's 0 with 39 other zeros after it. Its range is infinite, and nobody really knows the particle it's being called the graviton. I'm just going to go quickly that a lot of the stuff started with Newton. Newton developed the first equations, and that was in the 1600s. Charles Darwin didn't come along until the 1800s. And he made one of the first major advances. Einstein came along and he elaborated further, and he had a different equation. Electromagnetism, the other force, that started off with electrostatic force in the 1785. That's when that was worked out. And then Maxwell came along, and in 1861, 100 years later, and he developed a way to relate electricity and magnetism together, and that's fundamental. The strong nuclear force that we just talked about, these are equations for it. The key name there is Yukawa, Hideki Yukawa, 1935. So that was in the previous century. I want to just comment about the weak nuclear force because I hate the name. A guy that worked at my university in Chicago, Enrico Fermi, developed this in 1930, and it was a precursor to the nuclear bomb. The weak nuclear force is essential for processes that govern the behavior of matter at both the subatomic and at cosmic scales. It drives proton-proton fusion, that makes all the elements. It enables synthesis of the elements. It enabled Big Bang nucleosynthesis, which made the first nuclei, like hydrogen. It contributes to the diversity of all the particles and interactions in nature, all of them. It also is important to help unstable nuclei transform into more stable ones. So it's a very powerful force. And the equations are there. I'm just putting that up as like art. I don't expect anybody to look at them more. So how many atoms are there in the universe? 10 to the 82. This is the standard model of elementary physics, and I'm going to show you how this is derived, not to teach you physics, but to show you a process that involved physicists getting together and cogitating or thinking about how to model things, and the model they came out with, you'll see at the end. So you have the three that we've already talked about, the up quark, down quark, and the electron, which is what we're familiar with everything that we deal with in biology. But there's also the gluon, the force bosons, the gluon, the photon, and these bosons down below, Z and W, are for the weak force, and there's the Higgs field there. The other ones are what are called flavors, they're fermions, and I don't really understand that well, and I'm not focused on that. So when did these show up? So again, God said, let there be a universe. Before 1 second was up, all the elementary particles that exist today were created. Elementary is that table I just showed you. That table completely was created. At 10 to the minus 6 seconds, it was done. And then the protons and neutrons, which is when the quarks get together and the gluons get together, that happened before 1 second, from 10 to minus 6 to 1 second. In less than 20 minutes, all the electrons showed up, and the first atomic nuclei showed up. That's when neutrons and protons, instead of just being made, they fused together to make nuclei. And that's called Big Bang nucleosynthesis. And that's from the weak, a big contributor is the weak nuclear force. Then 3 minutes to 380,000 years, by then you get the first neutral atoms, which are the start of action. That's the hydrogen and so forth. So it was a hot time. In the first 3 minutes, the temperature was 10 to the 11th power, which is 100 billion degrees Kelvin. 3 to 20 minutes, the temperature cooled down to 10 billion. And that's when you got the first atomic nuclei. At 380,000 years after the Big Bang, the temperature dropped to 3,000 degrees in the universe. And that's when you start getting the atoms, like hydrogen, helium, and lithium. It took 200 million years to get the first stars. And that's important because when the stars started to form, that's when we got other elements, the ones that you're made out of, that each of us are made out of. So the white, that's the core of the sun. The gravity from the mass and the heat created nuclear fusion, and you got hydrogen fusing with itself to make helium, and that corresponds to where it's done in the sun. And just so you know, it takes millions of years for anything made in the core of the sun to actually radiate as sunshine in our solar system. So the sun that's hitting you today, that was made millions of years ago. So you've got carbon there, then you have neon, then you have oxygen, our most populous form of our mass in our body. Then you have silicon, and in the middle you have iron. So that stage of making atoms kind of stops at the iron where the arrow is. So where about all the other elements? Well, when a sun dies, you get something called supernova nucleosynthesis. And that's when massive stars die in explosions and their extreme temperatures and pressures. All these elements scatter into space, and elements heavier than iron are formed through what's called rapid neutron capture. And these are real pictures taken from our telescopes and then processed so that we understand something we're looking at. Just so you know, that green tail extends for thousands of light years, not for 1,000 feet, but thousands of light years. It's spread throughout the universe. Also, we make smaller elements because of cosmic ray spallation. Lighter elements form when high energy cosmic rays from black holes, supernova, or rotating neutron stars collide with atomic nuclei and break them apart. So those are the three phenomena down below. The shock waves from the supernova, together with gravity, cause the enriched gas and dust released to form new stars and planetary systems. Earth and its atoms, including those in our bodies, were formed from this recycled material. So we are formed of space dust, period. So now we're going to look at some physical principles. In 1687, Newton came up with his 3 laws of motion. I'm not going to read these to you, but you remember the 3 laws of motion. Then thermodynamics came along and statistical mechanics. That's the study of energy, heat, work, and the statistical behavior of particles. And there are also 3 laws associated with that. If you can read it quickly, good. I just don't want to run out of time. But actually, mass and energy cannot be created or destroyed is something we talked about earlier. They are interchangeable in a closed system. And back in 1700, the conservation of mass was proposed. Then in the 1800s, conservation of energy. And both of them were brought together by Einstein in 1905. So Noether was a lady who was a mathematician, a PhD, who transformed all the math that eventually led to almost everything that I'm going to show you coming up. Because she understood in nature what are called symmetries. Symmetries means if I'm looking in that direction, the physics in that corner is no different than in back of me if I turn around and look here. And if you look at other symmetries, like on this side of the wall and that side of the wall in different coordinate systems, the laws of physics don't change. This is very important because it simplified the math. So she came up with the principle of all these conservation rules, which have since been adopted and are real, and she did this mathematically. Now let's talk again about relativity. It describes the laws of physics in the context of space and time. Einstein proposed this in 1905, special relativity. And the first principle he had is the speed of light is constant in a vacuum. And the other observation is kind of related to Noether's theorem. Time dilation and length contraction occur near the speed of light relative to a stationary observer. After that, he proposed general relativity in 1915, which is 10 years later, got a Nobel Prize. And that talks about gravity as being this curvature of space-time. So why am I even talking about this? Because to get to particle physics, you have to understand the physics of the universe. And so this is actually part of particle physics, even though this is cosmological. So principle one, the laws of physics are identical in all inertial frames of reference. That's the symmetry issue. There's absolutely there's absolutely no rest frame. And principle two, the speed of light in a vacuum is a constant, which we just mentioned. Where did the interconvertibility of mass and energy come from? Well, it first came mathematically from a guy named Lorentz. Then Einstein came along and actually, he really made it happen. This is Lorentz's equation. He just didn't understand what he had. And that was in 1897. Then came Einstein. He figured it out and actually understood much better energy mass equivalence, which resulted in E equals mc squared. Then he came along and developed this field equation for general relativity. The best way to summarize this, because most people don't understand it, is that mass energy, which are the same, tells space-time how to curve. And curved space-time tells mass energy how to move. It relates the curvature of space-time to the distribution of matter and energy within it. So if you're modeling systems that are biological or physical or whatever, it's good to at least understand this. So let's go into quantum mechanics and quantum field theory. And I've made it not boring, I hope. First of all, in 1900, Max Planck came up with the word quantum, which is amount. Energy is emitted or absorbed in discrete units called quanta, and it's the smallest possible unit of a physical property like energy or momentum. A photon is a quantum of light. Quanta of energy are released or absorbed by electrons in an atom. Quanta has specific implications. Particles are excitations or quanta of their underlying quantum field. They aren't like in those pictures that I showed you with the circle for a gluon or a circle for electron. Particles are excitations. They are the fundamental building blocks of particles and forces in the universe. And examples are the photon for electromagnetic field, the gluon for the strong nuclear force, the electron, and the quark. Those are all examples of fundamental building blocks that are quanta. They're discrete. They represent indivisible units of a physical quantity. They have what's called wave-particle duality, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. And they're quantized. That means they have specific discrete values, like energy or angular momentum. So before we move on, I just want to show you this 1801 experiment called a double slit experiment from Thomas Young. And I think he's a Brit. So if you take a photon and throw it at the wall, it's going to land right where you expect it. And that's how come you know a photon is a particle. But if you take a light beam from a laser and you shine it through two slits, you get an interference pattern, like waves. And that's the manifestation of the wave particle duality. And that is capturing, in essence, where quantum mechanics came from. And it's hard for humans to understand that. Even Einstein and everybody else said this is a difficult concept because we're not structured in our brain to be able to figure this out. But that's what the math shows, and that's what the experiment shows. Quantum mechanics, that's the study of matter and energy at atomic and subatomic levels. It explains atomic structure and chemical bonding. This guy is another Brit, and not far from here in Westminster Abbey is his tomb with his famous equation on it. It's a cornerstone of modern physics, quantum field theory, and standard model of particle physics. It merged quantum mechanics and special relativity. This is in 1928, and he was only 20 years old at the time. It predicted antimatter. It predicted the electron's magnetic moment, and it describes the spin of what are called 1/2 particles, half particle spin. And those are electrons and quarks, but not photons. Those are spin one. So that's what's on his grave, is the one that's in blue. The Schrödinger equation, it's the fundamental equation of quantum mechanics. It describes how the waveform of a quantum system changes over time. It's actually analogous to Newton's second law, but much more predictive of what's happening physically. It predicts the future behavior of a quantum system, revealing its energy levels and wave functions from which other properties like momentum and potential location can be determined. All of this is relevant if you're going to model life. It also, of course, demonstrates energy quantization. So a whole bunch of physicists, but primarily Pauli, who was responsible for our understanding of how molecules come from atoms, and Dirac and Heisenberg from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, they developed quantum field theory. That's a framework combining quantum mechanics and special relativity to describe particles as excitations of quantum fields, which we talked about. And photons are that example. Also, that example are what happens to electrons when you look at orbitals around an atom and it's meeting another atom with different orbital structure. It yields, finally, the standard model of particle physics. So a quantum field is a mathematical entity that exists throughout all of space and time. It is not a physical object. It is a framework that describes how particles and forces behave. So this is how physicists approach this problem. They created this. In quantum field theory, every type of particle, example, electrons, quarks, photons, gluons, is associated with a specific quantum field. How quantum fields work? Quantum fields are not static, they fluctuate and vibrate. These fluctuations give rise to particles. Particles are excitations, again, or quanta of their corresponding quantum field. And there are some examples. Quantum fields and forces. Forces between particles are also described by quantum fields, like the electromagnetic force is mediated by the photon field. The strong nuclear force, like we talked about earlier, is mediated by the gluon field. So when particles interact, they do so by exchanging excitations of these fields. For example, quarks interact by exchanging gluons. If they didn't do that, the quarks would immediately shoot away from each other. That quantum fields and energy, quantum fields can store energy. For example, the energy of the gluon field is inside a proton, contributes to the proton mass. In fact, like 99% of its mass. So now we are at the standard model of particle physics. And this is when the physics community got together, lots of Nobel Prize winners in there, and they put together a mathematical representation of everything I've just talked about. And that model they just developed describes 3 of the 4 fundamental forces, gravity not being one of them. And it describes all the fundamental particles and it predicted the Higgs mechanism, which Professor Higgs discovered here or proposed here in 1962 in London. And you've seen it already. This is the standard model of elementary physics, of elementary particles. What you didn't see is what I'm going to show you next. I'm going to show you the math that led to this. This is the standard model of particle physics, written out in 1975, and it predicts everything in that table. And notice there's quantum mechanics, space-time, gravity, other forces, matter, and the Higgs mechanism. That's all in there. But this is shorthand. This is a little bit more longhand. This is what's called Lagrangian form of what I just showed you. But if you want to see the computational form that's fed into the computer, that's this. That's one equation. And actually, that could be expanded even further if you take away some of the other shorthand in the equation. I can't leave this subject of quantum without talking about entanglement, because there are a lot of freaky things that come out of this. Quantum entanglement is when two particles form at the same time. This is not intuitive. You keep one particle here and the other one you throw to the other side of the galaxy. Whatever I do to this particle over here somehow is manifest in that particle on the other side of the galaxy. They're entangled across space-time. And that has been proven. The next crazy thing, quantum superposition. That's when a particle could be spinning to the right and to the left at the exact same time. We cannot picture that in our own minds. But that comes out of the math, and that's been observed, and that's the whole basis behind quantum computing. And then the third one's really crazy, quantum tunneling. So if I have a tennis ball and I throw it at that wall, it will bounce back because that's a resistance. But if I take a rock that's really big and I throw that really hard, I may get the rock to go through the wall by breaking it. In quantum tunneling, what happens is a particle is moving along, encounters a resistance, vanishes, and reappears on the other side of the resistance, and then keeps on traveling. That's quantum tunneling. These fall out of these equations, and all three of them have been confirmed experimentally. So they're real. So these equations really are powerful. So now we're going to evolution of life. We're going to do this a lot quicker because you guys know about nucleic acids. First thing is valence. Just to mention, valence is a measure of an atom's ability to bond with other atoms. So we've talked about the evolution of the particles. Now particles making atoms, and then atoms make molecules. The valence is determined by the outer valence electrons. Their common types of molecular bonds are covalent bonds and ionic bonds, and of course the ionic bonds are stronger. There are also metallic bonds where electrons just freely float between atoms, and they're hydrogen bonds, which are actually electrostatic attractions other than the H2O. It's the H to the O from another neighboring water molecule. That makes a lattice. So let's look at time. The Earth started 4.54 billion years ago. 4.54 billion years ago. 4.5 to 4 billion years ago, abiogenesis occurred. The first organic molecules appeared, and that included amino acids and nucleotides. The mechanism was thought to have been well modeled by this experiment done at University of Chicago by Miller and Urey in 1952. And what they did was they essentially put hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in a flask. They added lightning in the form of electrical stimulation, and they produced small organic molecules, including amino acids. Then they heated that, they heated that up and then circulated that around, and they found these small proteins. So along that time, and not modeled, is the simple thiols. Those are molecules that contain sulfur. They were probably abundant on early Earth, and they are responsible for non-enzymatic peptide bond formation. That's what's thought to be the case. And then this gentleman from France in 1995 proposed the thioester world hypothesis. And in 2025, a few months ago, not far from where we're standing right now, Powner at the University College London published in Nature verification that this is supported. So thioesters provided the thermodynamic driving force leading to RNA polymerization. Thioesters are prime candidates for driving the prebiotic, pre-life synthesis of RNA, bridging the gap between the thioester world and the RNA world. 4 to 3.8 billion years ago is when RNA first appeared. That's the beginning of genetic information and likely kickstarted the evolution of life. The first step towards cellular life were lipid bilayers that formed in water because of the polar and nonpolar ends. And those wrapped on each other and closed the volume off and made protocells. So if Earth started 4.54 billion years ago, it took 1 billion years for life to start. And it started off as single-celled organisms that likely formed around hydrothermal vents. They were called prokaryotes. They were unicellular, no nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. And by this time, RNA on the ribose lost a hydroxyl group and became DNA. Prokaryotic life thrived for billions of years, and there's our real ancestor for you, me, and everybody else, including the Pope. It is a bacteria. And they thrived on chemical energy, chemosynthesis is what it's called, or they thrived on sunlight, which is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis really came into its own shortly afterwards when cyanobacteria developed some way to make energy from sunlight, but they were underwater. And these bacteria changed the atmosphere and the ocean to be oxygenated. And as oxygen rose, they did better and better because the efficiency of energy production was so much better with oxygen. And the anaerobic organisms went extinct, a lot of them. So 2 billion years, 2.5 billion years after the universe, after Earth was founded or formed, which is 2 billion years ago, eukaryotes appeared. And they were really just prokaryotes who ate things. And you could see invagination of the membrane, and they ate things. So mitochondria evolved from engulfed alpha proteobacteria, chloroplasts that are responsible for photosynthesis. They evolved from engulfed cyanobacteria. Eukaryotes enabled evolution and eventually multicellular organisms. So plants and animals arose from the eukaryotes. All their organelles were membrane bound, which gave them more protection. And then the real action started 541 million years ago, which is 4 billion years after this plant was open. This Earth was open for business. So it took 4 billion years to get to this point, but things happened to cause a rapid diversification of underwater life, and it was exponential as all these mechanisms started having synergistic activities. Land-based life occurred shortly afterwards as animals started coming out of the water and started getting onto land. And that included adaptations that are like roots, vascular systems, and lungs. 250 to 65 million years ago, you know about the dinosaurs. They went extinct after an asteroid impact 65 million years ago. If they didn't go extinct, you and I would not be here probably. And then from 65 million years ago to now, is the evolution of primates and eventually to humans. Now, I'm going to point out something that is really interesting. 1-point mutation, the NOVA1 gene, 1-point mutation is responsible for why Homo sapiens were able to evolve and survive. The DNA point mutation led to a valine instead of an isoleucine in the NOVA alternative splicing regulator 1 protein. This enabled human language and brain development. It gave us a competitive advantage over all the other hominids. And then in the last 10,000 years, civilization advanced and so forth. So today's mysteries that still remain are biologic, like brain function, embryology. And in physics, it's dark energy and dark matter. The conclusion, physics teaches that we evolve from and are energy. That's what we are. We're just packaged. Now, the interesting thing about that statement is that 13.7 billion years ago is when the universe started. Energy evolved for 13.7 billion years into consciousness and self-awareness. So if we are energy, we are now sorting out what happened. So energy led to this thought process. Now, physicists are well ahead of us on the modeling, though they're only modeling what they can observe, which is 5% of the universe. But they've been able to explain almost everything using their mathematical model. So the final statement is, medical innovation is transitioning to a quantitative discipline. This is the time because of all the amazing things that are coming together. And the good news is, unlike in physics, life is directly observable. So the job ahead of us may be a lot easier than what the physicists had to go through when they came up with all of this. I think if we incorporate physics, math, engineering into the training of a biologist, you'll have an awesome person to try and sort out a model that can help us avoid having to trial and error all sorts of things in people. Thank you.